so I may not come across as a Transformers fan, and that's because I'm really not. I've seen bits and pieces of movies and TV shows, but never really became a fan of it as a kid. But for whatever reason, a series of collectible robots that could transform into various vehicles through the means of following instructions appealed to me as an adult. Draw your own conclusions. So after finding a Coronation Starscream online for 50 quid in box, I began another collection of pointless stuff. Long story short, I ended up watching Transformers the movie, and wasted even more money on cool plastic. So let's try and justify this by talking about the movie that ruined childhoods for its 40th anniversary. I think the first thing I have to talk about is how I ended up watching this film, despite my lack of interest in the franchise. Well, the answer is very simple. Too many YouTubers I was watching doing videos on it, or briefly discussing it in larger videos. And by too many, I mean 2, which is already too many. So unlike the many kids who watched it in the cinema back in the 1980s, I didn't see it until the mid-2020s, and so was an adult at the time. And for some reason I keep talking about it like it was the far off past when it was only 1 year ago. Because of this, the famous and perhaps notorious twist had already been spoiled for me, meaning my experience with it was very different to most others. While I had grown up in the world where Transformers existed, for me I'd only seen the first live action Transformers film and bits and pieces of various animated shows. This was the first time that I'd been interested and therefore seeked out a part of the franchise. And as I stated before, my interest was from several YouTubers talking about this film, and I was mostly drawn in by the animation. I will talk about the animation briefly, but my interest here lies in the plot, the characters, and kind of its existence as a TV series that became a film. So onto the plot of the film. It's probably not as well known as you'd think. Well, everyone knows about the twist of Optimus's death. That only occurs in the first third of the film, and so a lot of the film doesn't get as widely discussed. I'll talk about this section of the film first, as it's the most connected to the original show. In fact, this entire film acts as a bit of a wrap-up for the show effectively, and so the first half an hour is just resetting the stage for the new audience. The main show took place in the 80s, and so there is a time skip with this film beginning in the far-off future of 2005, a year that is as far away from us now as the show's original run was from it. This time skip allows for the entire state of affairs to have been shaken up from the show. No longer are there two sides fighting on Earth, instead the leaders have returned to Cybertron, and during that time the Autobots have claimed the 2 moons, and built a city on Earth, all as set up to launch an attack on the Decepticons and retake their home world. This allows for both new and old audiences to be introduced to the setting somewhat, as things have changed up enough for fans who watch the show religiously to need at least some catch up on the situation, and all that's occurred since the show's original setting. This section of the film focuses on the Decepticons launching an attack on Autobot City on Earth, which is what leads to the deaths of many toys that weren't selling well. I mean the deaths of several of the old characters, most notably Optimus Prime. Everyone knows this bit of the film to some degree or another, and it is what tends to get referenced in later films, for better or for worse. This part of the film is very close to just spectacle, as there isn't really much character development here, as that's left for the rest of the film. The Battle of Autobot City is a very intense and quite bloody battle, despite the lack of blood, with guns having a sense of power behind them for the first time. I'll talk about Optimus's death in the character section, as while it does affect the plot, it's worth its own moment. As for the main plot, it's somewhat simplistic, with it being the general hero story where someone goes from nothing or making mistakes to the leader of his people. In this case, Hot Rod, who is the main lead. His journey begins with Optimus's death, as that's when the Autobots on Earth are split up, and so Hot Rod has to take up a leadership role for his group to ensure they survive. A lot of the film has the surviving Autobots trying to survive the Decepticons who pursue them across the galaxy, which leads to an admittedly boring stretch of the characters getting separated and trapped on another planet, which feels a lot like padding with a bit of character work here and there. During all of this, the film is also dealing with the main threat, Unicron, a planet-sized being that destroys planets for reasons that aren't explained, but effectively for food. Unicron is a very powerful foe, but one that is forced to rely on others to do its work, which leads to it using the damaged Decepticons as its puppets to destroy the Matrix of leadership. The Matrix being the only thing that can destroy Unicron, and is what is held by the Prime of the Autobots. So Optimus until his death, and then Ultra Magnus for most of the film. Unicron's powers aren't really explored, but we know he has the ability to manipulate Cybertronians and upgrade them, but lacks the ability to control their minds fully, and so is forced to hope for the best while inflicting mental pain on them. The final part of the film is again action, with the battle for Cybertron, with Unicron planning on destroying the planet to deal with all the Cybertronians in one swift action and remove all potential threats to him. Due to the scale of Unicron, it means that a lot of the battle boils down to Hot Rod versus Galvatron, while other smaller battles play out. The battle is fun enough, but is really held up by the character arcs of Hot Rod and Galvatron, as this is where the former unlocks the power of the Matrix and becomes Rodimus Prime, while Galvatron is finally defeated. The wrap-up of the film is quite interesting, as despite us not seeing it, the Decepticons have been defeated and thrown off of Cybertron. This all happens off-screen, as while obviously the defeat of Galvatron would have had an impact on them, the Decepticons still held the planet entirely, and so just seem to have left it behind them for no good reason. It's a bit of a sudden wrap-up to the series' long plotline, as while there were still a few more seasons following this film, they were very different to what had come before the movie. It's now time to discuss the characters of the film, as they are kind of what carried the film, as the plot is quite thin. There are three sides within the film: the Autobots, the Decepticons, and Unicron, but even then there are two categories of characters: the returning characters and the new ones. We'll begin with the old characters, and there are quite a few, which leads to several being a bit bland, which is partly due to the number, but also because of the several deaths that occur. As someone who's very unfamiliar with the majority of the G1 cartoon, I can't say all that much about how well they match up with their TV versions, and so I'll focus on them as film characters only. So firstly we have the Autobots, with most from the show getting killed quite quickly, with only a few surviving. Notably for newer audiences, Bumblebee survives, but there are also the Dinobots, with Grimlock being the only one with any character in the film. Grimlock is quite a dumb character, with him being powerful but is basically just a battering ram for the Autobots, which is useful for battle but terrible for drama, while mixed for comedy, as it depends on if his comedy is what you enjoy. Sadly, most of the already existing Autobots die in the film, with many getting very little fanfare, notably Wheeljack, whose body is just found, and that's his first appearance in the film. Due to this, it's very difficult to talk about most of them, as they have such little screen time that there's basically nothing to say about most of them, unless you're already familiar with them, in which case you'd be talking about them outside of the context of the film. The only character that is really an exception to this is the main character of the G1 cartoon, Optimus Prime, and the only dead one that people really care about, or at least the one that people still talk about in any detail. Prime is a very well-known character, but his G1 characterisation is a bit different to the more common characterisation of him. There are still a lot of similarities between them, but his death in this film really went on to affect the character's trajectory later in the franchise. Optimus here is a confident leader who doesn't really have much of a sense of humour and is dedicated to his mission of liberating Cybertron, with him basically always in a stern mood as to deal with any situation which could occur. This is something which continues throughout and only becomes more prominent during the attack on Autobot City, where the situation is so serious that there is no room for lightheartedness. His confrontation with Megatron is where we really see how much he might have changed across this time skip between the show and the film, as unlike the old days where he was very willing to allow Megatron to escape and return next episode, this time he's basically out for blood, deciding that this time he will put Megatron down for good. Their battle is quite an intense one, and if not for the intervention of Hot Rod, would have almost certainly led to Prime's victory, although whether or not he will have survived the battle is up for debate. Optimus' death is what everyone talks about with this film, and for good reason, as it's very intense for what is a movie to sell toys to kids. Against the other characters who just die, Prime gets a proper send-off, and the way it's presented is both heartbreaking and quite adult to be honest. The performances in this scene is only part of what makes it powerful, as just the way it plays out is distinctive, with it clearly resembling a family watching a relative die in hospital, all standing around, knowing the end is near but not wanting to accept it. This is one of Peter Cullen's great performances, with him delivering some jaw-dropping dialogue incredibly well. I mean, who would go into a kids film and expect to watch a character tell you not to grieve their death?
Do not grieve.
Really, Prime's death is one of those things where you wonder how it could have possibly made it to the screen, something I will talk about more later. Now for the new toys, I mean Autobots, and the most notable is Hot Rod, given he is the main character of the film, and responsible for every child's trauma as he played a big part in Optimus' death. Hot Rod is written with the standard hero's journey for his arc, going from a hothead younger character to the leader of the Autobots, represented through him unlocking the Matrix and gaining the title of Prime. Now it's very well known that despite all he goes through, Hot Rod is not a very liked character, entirely due to him killing Optimus Prime essentially, as it was his interference in the fight which allowed Megatron to gain the upper hand. It's clear what the writers were going for with this idea, but it's something far too strong for a young audience to accept, and not just hate the new character, especially given that the film isn't the most complex, and so his arc is somewhat limited, plus the screen time issue. Now I have to say that Hot Rod as a character, entirely disconnected from Prime's death, is actually a good one. He's quite simple really, but that allows for him to have a standard but complete arc in the film, that is very focused on selling you new toys. I think the biggest problem with Hot Rod is something I will discuss more later, but in short, the target audience of the film. Hot Rod is a character that works better and relates more to an older teen audience, where the rebels of society are, the hotheads of a generation. While not perfect as an allegory, if you think of him in this context, then he's someone who's going into adulthood, and his journey in the film is that, going from a teen to adult with responsibilities. That's the hidden strength of Hot Rod, as he's actually quite relatable, but just not to who he is being sold to. The rest of the newbies are less complex, but most are quite fun characters, most notably Cup, who is the one stranded with Hot Rod, and so gets a lot more screen time than the others. Beyond that, he also gets a good dynamic with the Dinobots, and is someone they can actually respect and obey. Cup is an older character in terms of age, with him being quite experienced, and having a story for every occasion. He's a fun character, and is sort of put in an old wise mentor role for Hot Rod, even though he's really not suited to that sort of position, and so played a big part in leading him to the path of leadership. Next is RC, the female of the film, but is someone who isn't willing to sit around while the others do all the work, and is able to verbally spar with her fellow Autobots. She's an enjoyable character, but is mostly tasked with looking after Daniel. I really haven't much to say about RC in the film, as she does often feel like the female of the group, the female toy to be sold, which is unfortunate, but not unexpected from this era. It is at least good that she gets some good dialogue, and isn't really seen by her fellow Autobots as the female, even if the limited scope of the film does make her feel like that at times. The final character of note is Ultra Magnus, who is the false leader. By that I mean he's the one who seems to be the obvious leader in Prime's stead, but is not up to the task. The idea of Ultra Magnus seeming to be a new leader is something very clearly tied to his design, as he is very similar in appearance to Optimus, which I think in earlier drafts he was going to be his ghost or something. Either way, Magnus's arc is learning that he isn't the leader type, or at least for the entire Autobot race, never being too sure of himself and always wanting the wisdom of Optimus after his death. There is something compelling here, and his inner conflict does lead to his death when trying to use the Matrix to save people. Wait, what's that? He doesn't die. So this is a big problem within the film, as despite literally exploding, Ultra Magnus is quickly rebuilt, which kind of ruins all the other deaths and does make them clearly a studio mandate. While there is an excuse of them being on another planet and so the inhabitants are able to repair them, then suddenly you've introduced a plot point that suggests that every dead character can be revived, as he was clearly not functioning in the same way as other dead characters were. It's one of the missteps of the film as a story, as reviving a dead character in the film you've just introduced the concept of death to completely destroys the stakes you've just established, unless you have a bloody good reason for it, which this film doesn't. Now for the Decepticons, and things are a bit different here, as unlike with the Autobots, the dead Decepticons are revived and rebuilt by Unicron, most notably Megatron becoming Galvatron, and so it's difficult to figure out if they are meant to be the same or different characters, given they share memories but only have slight differences. Due to this, we'll begin with the ones that don't get rebuilt, and the notable one of them is Starscream. Starscream really only has two major scenes, and both really sum up his personality. The first being when he throws the damaged Megatron into space, and then fills the now empty void of leadership for the Decepticons. Then his later scene sees his attempted coronation where everything is about him, getting annoyed when little interruptions are happening, this ending in his death at the hands of Galvatron, with him being the most notable death on the side of the Decepticons. This is where I have to blame Starscream for my interest in the film, as it was the studio series model for Coronation Starscream that took my interest, and so finding it boxed at a pretty good price, I bought it and it was all downhill from there. There are other old Decepticons in the film, but none with this sort of screen time, and so just have a bit of a group mentality against being characters. This is notable when they all begin fighting over who will be the next leader, but even when they are serving someone, they are given far less personality than whoever is leading at the time. This does work for characters like Soundwave, who only occasionally speak, and so you don't really notice him suffering from this as much as the others. Now let's discuss the rebuilt Decepticons, and there isn't much to say here either, as most of them follow this group mentality, with the exception of Megatron, later Galvatron. Megatron is a bit of a weird villain, as he's not exactly intimidating, but neither is he too comedic to take seriously. His attack on Autobot City does make him a notable threat, with his willingness to kill just being the tip of the iceberg of his lack of morals, something which gives him the kill on Optimus. This underhanded nature is something that I think defines Megatron, but he's perhaps not the most suited to being a leader, although it could just be that all Decepticons are ready to cause internal chaos the moment they can, given that despite him not actually being dead, his entire army turn their back on him and are willing to leave him to die just to ensure their own survival in the moment. I will admit though that I do find his voice a bit grating, but is better in the film than it was in the series. Galvatron on the other hand is a bit of an upgrade in terms of his leadership skills, but isn't that much smarter. Despite being the servant of Unicron, he has his own mind and so he's able to attempt to rebel on several occasions. But all these attempts are stopped and lead to him being mentally tormented as punishment. It's clear that Galvatron isn't the sort who is willing to be in a subservient role to anyone, something so tied to him that despite all the pain he goes through, he continues to resist, which is what leads to Unicron attacking Cybertron. The exact differences between Galvatron and Megatron are a bit difficult to understand without a better idea of Megatron, but it's clear that they share many elements. But Galvatron is more refined and so is willing to take immediate action, best demonstrated by how each handles Starscream. Megatron was willing to allow Starscream to exist and would prefer to punish him rather than actually deal with him, while Galvatron kills him the first moment they meet. Of course in the film Megatron is a lot more willing to take action that kills the opposite side, which kind of messes with this comparison, so whether using the context of the TV series to point out these differences is allowed or not is questionable, but you could easily make the argument that he went through development during the time skip. Now let's talk about the two human characters, and there's not all much to say about them, but there's a few things to note about them. These two are original series characters Spike and his son Daniel, the latter being made entirely for this film. Due to Spike being on the Cybertronian moons, it means that he isn't involved with the main events of the film, and is more so someone for Daniel to worry about. I do have to note a very particular line for a PG rated film though. Oh shit! It's very out of place, and I'll talk about it more later as it fits into a larger discussion. Daniel on the other hand gets a lot more to do, and even partakes in the action by using a mech suit. Due to him being on Earth, it means that he is caught up in the Battle of Autobot City, and then ends up travelling through space with the rest of the main characters, leading to him having to be watched over by some of the Autobots. While I did say before that RC babysat him, that's not exactly true, as while she is the main one looking after him, Daniel is able to protect himself once he has the mech suit, and so isn't in too much danger despite the situations he finds himself in. Finally, we have Unicron. So Unicron isn't a very compelling character, but is the big bad of the film, although not the main threat until the last few minutes when he takes direct action and attempts to destroy Cybertron. Unicron is the first thing we meet in the film, as he's introduced by destroying another robotic civilization, which sets up his power immediately. But from there he's mostly in the background due to his fear of the Matrix, due to it being the only thing that can destroy him. As a character, I think that Unicron is held up by the performance, rather than the actions, given that he's mostly in the background, and his most memorable moments are entirely dialogue based. The only times that he does things are when he destroys a planet at the start, rebuilds the Decepticons, and then his attack on Cybertron. The first scene is entirely set up for his existence, and so he doesn't have any character involved, unlike the other two. The attack on Cybertron doesn't have much character either, as after he talks with Galvatron, he just becomes a place for the battle to occur. I will admit that the scene where he rebuilds the Decepticons is one where the character is at the forefront, with him insulting Megatron and making his presence known. But the scene does play out a bit like a commercial, with him giving the names and the full descriptions of all the new toys, I mean Decepticons. Now this isn't to say that Unicron isn't an intimidating foe, and one that's perfect for a movie, especially one that kind of brings an end to the cartoon, or at least its first era. I do very much like his transformation scene, as the grand scale of Unicron is really demonstrated. It's one of those scenes where the animation and music shine, which is something that happens quite often in this film. So with all the characters discussed, I want to talk briefly about the film's cast, as it's quite something. Clearly, to get some big names on the poster, this film used several actors who were notable at the time, most of which I don't know anything about, and likewise I bet many kids at the time knew a similar amount, and so it feels like a scheme to bring in the adults or get them to see it as more than just a 90-minute toy commercial. Out of the main cast, there's really only two I want to talk about, due to me actually knowing who they are. The first being Leonard Nimoy, who was and still is of course famous for playing Spock in Star Trek. Nimoy played Galvatron in the film, and other than giving the character a more tolerable voice than Megatron, he also made him a smarter sounding foe, despite his actions, and so does make him seem more threatening than he once was. A fun fact to me though, is that since Megatron was played by Frank Welker, this wasn't the only time in the 80s that both actors would play different versions of the same character in the film, as only 2 years earlier, in the Star Trek film The Search for Spock, Welker provided the screen for a young Spock. The other actor of note is Orson Welles, an actor who was completely out of place in an animated kids film. Yes, Citizen Kane himself was in this 90-minute toy commercial. So the question is, how did Orson Welles end up in this film? And the answer is very simple. He was in desperate need for money by this point in his life. After much earlier success in his career, Welles' career had taken a turn, and combined with his monstrous appetite, it meant that he was always in need of funds, and so he did any movie role that he could get, and above that, a lot of advertising. So what was better than a 90-minute toy commercial? What makes the story more interesting though, is that this would be Welles' final acting role, as he would die only a short time after recording his lines, meaning that his autobiography basically ends with him talking about his time on this film. That's quite the end to a biography, I must say. The animation of the movie is something that is worth noting, as despite it being a 90-minute toy commercial, it still looks incredible 40 years later, and really makes it difficult to impossible to go back to the TV series afterwards, especially if you watch the film first. The film looks beautiful to this day, with incredible shading and movement. There are a few errors here and there, but that's to be expected of animation, as very few animated films are perfect. The designs from the show really shine here, and finally have some life to them against the more stilted performances of the show. The action scenes are amazing, as there is a great sense of speed when in vehicle mode, and then the Transformers feel almost human in movement when in robot form, very detached from the very robotic movement that people had come to expect of them. Given the high detail involved with the designs, it's amazing that the animators were able to manage it, with some scenes being downright beautiful, notably Optimus's battle with the Decepticons and Unicron's transformation, which to me are highlights. But there are many scenes which still look amazing and do show the effort put into this film, with the budget always showing, and it is great to see that despite the film being a toy commercial, the producers didn't cheap out on it, which was a decision which has been horrible for my wallet this past year. Now for the soundtrack of the film, and it's very 80s. In fact, the soundtrack is probably what dates the film the most. Admittedly, I don't have much to say about the soundtrack beyond that, as a lot of the incidental music tends to be enjoyable, but in the background to the action scenes, plus the songs with lyrics, which are what the film is remembered for. The song The Touch has become iconic for all Transformers fans, and hasn't been allowed to be forgotten by the franchise. You got the touch. The other songs are just as strong as well, but don't stick with you as much as The Touch, due to how the song has been beaten into the fans over the decades, plus its placement being at two of the most important parts of the film, which means you'll probably end up hearing this song the most when rewatching those scenes over and over. So now we have to talk about the film's existence, notably the target audience problem, I've mentioned a few times. Firstly though, I want to talk about why the film was made, and that's easily explained, as to sell toys. Notably though, this was at a time when Hasbro needed to introduce a bunch of new toys to the franchise, while also writing out a lot of the old ones that had been popular for years but weren't selling as well anymore. This led to the film's creation, as it for one allowed for the franchise to have a wider reach and therefore find new audiences, while also making the change of the cast very clear. The show up to this point had characters just appearing or disappearing whenever Hasbro wanted to sell a new toy, but the film decided instead to kill anyone who wasn't going to be available anymore, just to make things clear. This is where the target audience problem comes into play, as many deaths alongside other elements seem a bit too grown up for the child audience that this film is aimed at. While kids' media in the 80s was a lot less sanitised than it is nowadays, the film goes a bit too far. The use of the word shit is a clear example, as swear words are out of place in a kids' film. You could get away with it in a PG film if it was aimed at an older audience, but that's not what happened here. Now we have the deaths, and this is where the problem is at its most prominent, as death is something that's very difficult to understand for a child audience, and so kids' media tends to avoid it as much as possible, or if they do cover it, they have a dedicated episode where it's the focus. But in this film, death is just a fact of life. It's not even sugar-coated. Characters are shot and die. It's very warlike and real, a grittier depiction of death that many shows aimed at older audiences still try to avoid. Watching this as someone in their 20s with the ability to really understand what's happening, it creates a bit of an inner conflict, as while I do enjoy getting a grittier and more adult depiction of death in something with a lower age rating, this is something out of place for the intended kid audience. Because of this, it really ends up feeling like a film made for a teen audience, as if the producers were making it for the fans who had grown up with the series, something which would have made sense either a few years or a decade after the show's original broadcast. But this is only 2 years into its run, and so the audience was still young. But even if we consider this approach, the problem is that killing off most of the cast doesn't feel like something that would appeal to fans. Instead, they would just get annoyed for another reason. It was Hasbro themselves who wanted the character deaths, and so writer Ron Friedman was clearly working within his instructions to create a story. And when dealing with death, it's clear that someone would approach things with a bit more of an adult mindset, leading to the tone of the film and the fact that it's clearly designed for an older audience than the people Hasbro wanted to sell toys to. So that's the Transformers the movie, a very wild ride to say the least. The film is stunning in its animation and has excellent performances from its star-studded cast, not to mention the regulars from the show itself that stepped up their game for this cinematic release. Its weakness obviously lies in its confused target audience, clearly being too adult for the audience it wants to sell toys to, but then too kiddish for an older audience. While decades later the audience that this film was somewhat accidentally designed for came to be, this is only something that exists in retrospect, and outside of the context the film originally existed in. It's very much a film of the 80s, a lot of action and music which seriously dates it. The action can sometimes be a bit draining, which combined with a somewhat dull middle section on another planet, means that the film does have the potential to be a bit of a slog to get through. As a potential conclusion to the series, it works well, as it technically ends the war between the Autobots and Decepticons, while also introducing a new and far more dangerous threat, which while exclusive to the film, serves its purpose well. The higher stakes that are added to the film due to the deaths does add some tension, which suits the final story, even if that's taken away from when the new toys get repaired. I will admit though, even though I'm someone who still isn't a big fan of Transformers, I do really enjoy this film for what it is. It's certainly more of a popcorn film rather than something especially deep, but that's not something to hold against it, as it does try to be a bit deeper than the show was constructed for. Not every film needs to be a metaphorical or emotional masterpiece to be good, and this film is proof of that. It is certainly problem-ridden, but that's something I doubt anyone would be surprised of. It was made to sell toys and nothing else, so the fact it holds up this well is a sign of how well constructed it actually is.